please do not exit the podcast. I promise you that even though bonds get a boring reputation, it is anything but boring. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another great episode of Mint Money, where we talk about all things personal finance in the state of Michigan. Kevin, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Good weekend for you?
Oh my, it feels like a lifetime ago. I mean, it was a long weekend, right? I mean, we're going to date ourselves, but Memorial Day weekend, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
It was actually pretty relaxing because both of my boys went up north to friends' houses, so it was just Jody, I, and Gigi. So it was pretty chill.
We had good weather all the way around because I can remember, and I'm sure other Michiganders or people outside the state can relate back to, it's really a crapshoot if the weather's going to be good or not.
Yeah. This time of year, you just don't know, right? When you get to July, you hope like July through mid-August at least, like you're going to get that 80-plus kind of weather.
Beautiful.
Relatively dry, right? So that you're not getting a lot of rain in that season. But yeah, you never know.
I'm sure the lakes are still cold, irregardless of any time in May, but it wouldn't surprise me, quite honestly, if sometime in the future, if we get, like, if you're over a Memorial Day weekend and you wake up and there's frost on the ground, quite honestly.
Sure.
I will not be at all surprised.
No. Actually, funny, interesting story. You know, I went to college in Colorado.
Yeah, sure.
So I graduated in June because I had to get like, I don't know, 3 or 4 extra credits to graduate. So I had to take like one, like, I don't know, 6 weeks summer semester or something. And I think I graduated like around like June 4th. Okay. And it snowed the day after I graduated. Now, granted, I was in Colorado, but even I was in Southwest Colorado, which is not typical to see snow that late in the year.
That's I don't know how they do it.
Yeah,
I don't know how they do it, but that reminds me of a story. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, where in the same 5-day stretch, it was 85, and 2 or 3 days later, it snowed in the same city.
And where was this?
I can't remember, maybe it was Denver or Boulder. It was 2 or 3 years ago, but just crazy temperature swings. But luckily in Michigan, once you get, into the heart of the summer, June, July, mid-August, you can definitely count snow out of the picture.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. Yeah, right.
Yeah. And so now switching to today's topic. And so I'm going to go mention today's topic. Please do not exit the podcast. I promise you that even though bonds get a boring reputation, it is anything but boring. Now, of course, this is me. And within our investment team, I am known as the bond guy.
You are, yeah.
It is a lot more complex of a field, and there are a lot of nuances that people should be aware of because not all bonds are built the same. You know, there are some that are good sleep at night insurance, but there are some bonds out there. Think about junk bonds or high yield bonds that act more like stocks. Can have more stock-like returns.
So first question I have for you. What is, because you are the bond guy when it comes to the portfolio management team. So what is it that draws you to fixed income investing? What do you like about it?
Sure. I just think it's such a complex field because if you just go compare an index, go compare the S&P 500 index. And so you have your substandard 500 stocks that are within that index. So for a given bond index, there could be thousands of bond issues that could be a little bit different from each other. And so what I mentioned by that is that one of those S&P 500 companies that are within that constituent index could have 10, 15, or 20 different bond issues.
Sure.
And within there, they could pledge different areas of, I'm going to explain things simplistically here.
Sure.
There could be different varying levels of collateral that are assigned to each and every one of those security issues. And so it's a very complex field. And in my opinion, it's a little bit more granular. And then when you think about that return stream that you get within fixed income, it can be a lot more math driven because obviously you're relying upon where you buy that bond, whether it's at par, if you're buying at a discount, below par, or above par. Now, I'm throwing out the term par, but par just means you buy that bond at 100.
Right.
And then eventually that bond has a maturity date and is going to mature in the future at 100.
Yeah.
So do you buy that bond below 100, above 100, so on and so forth.
Right.
But there's just so many complexities within that whole universe. And just what I mentioned, there's some bonds that are safe, some that are kind of right in the middle.
Yeah.
And you have bonds that are more junk distressed bonds. And it's a really exciting asset class.
Yeah. So you mentioned par and being able to buy at discount or at a premium, right? So let's talk a little bit more about that and maybe use today as an example. Right?
Yeah,
because I think that's an interesting topic for me and probably for you too.
Yeah, sure.
But when you think about that, like what are in terms of interest rates and interest rates rising and falling and how that affects the price of a bond? Talk a little bit about that.
And so bond prices and interest rates move in an inverse direction. And so as interest rates are rising, existing bonds that are out in the universe, the price is going to drop. And vice versa, if interest rates are going down, those existing bonds are going up. Now, why is that the case? Now, explaining, there could be a lot of nuances with every security, but this is just a very simplistic example for the sake of argument. And so if you have an existing 3% bond that's out in the market right now, and interest rates are projected to go up in the future, or if they're going in an upward trajectory, that 3% bond today may not be worth as much if in 6 months from now you could issue a bond if you're a company at 4 or 5%.
Right.
And so it's one of the reasons why there's an inverse relationship as it relates to that.
Yeah. I think a really simple analogy that I think about, I love live music, right?
Okay.
So I think about and there are times, you get like the VIP pre-sale email.
Yeah, sure.
And you're able to get in there and get the ticket to see the show that you want for $75. And so sometimes, you go in and buy the pre-sale ticket, you get a great deal, you pay $75. And then dependent upon the popularity of that show, the price of that ticket on the secondary market is going to go up or down.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
So
sure.
if it turns out a couple of months after you bought that $75 ticket that show is going to be really popular, maybe you can sell it for $150 or $250, right? If it's really popular. Say you're going to see Taylor Swift, one of your favorites, right?
Goodness. Yeah.
Where inversely, right, if it's not as popular, right, the cost is going to come down. So maybe a simple way to think about it.
I've never heard that example, but I think you're summing things up perfectly. And theoretically, there really is no limit for bonds out there. And so if every bond, as you can imagine, gets priced around par, I've seen some bonds, Kevin, be priced at $200 or $210.
Sure.
These are very safe bonds, but that coupon, which is theoretically, that's the income that gets delivered to the investor at the end of the day, that might be 8 or 9%, which if you think about from a couple years ago, which is when I saw this bond example, if that prevailing interest rate on that bond or coupon might be 2 or 3%, and you're earning 8 or 9% income, that's a lot of income. Now, some investors, they like their income from dividends, from stocks. Some people like it from the coupon payment from bonds. Every person's different out there, but it really relates back to what an investor might look like. And so for someone, they know that bond at 200 is eventually going to go down to 100 over time. But for some people, for that level of income, they're willing to go make that sacrifice.
Absolutely. Yep. So I've got a lot of questions for Will today because like we already established, Will is our bond expert. But so you talk about bonds and you talk about the nuances and how many different types there are. So, we have treasuries, there are corporates, there are investment grade, there are high yield, there are junk. There are just a number of different terminologies. There are municipal bonds, right? So I guess first up, let's talk about investment grade versus high yield / junk bonds. The differences between those.
And so think of a credit rating very much like a FICO score. And so bonds, there's 3 major credit rating agencies that are going to be able to go out. If you're an issuing firm like one of these S&P 500 firms, they can reach out to a rating agency and be like, hey, go rate my company. Let's see how financially sound you are. And given where that credit rating falls, that could be where that prevailing interest rate they might have to go pay for investors to be able to go finance that bond deal. And so very much like a FICO score, if you have really good finances, if you have a lot of cash on hand, not a lot of debt, your FICO score is going to be pretty high, like a credit rating, and then you're not going to have to pay as much when it relates to that interest rate payment. And so those are companies that are above investment grade. Now, junk isn't the perfect word. I think the better, more technical term is high yield.
Sure. But I think it is important for people to, because people do hear junk bonds. Yeah. I think it is more of like an 80s term.
Sure. Yeah, the 80s rally with it.
But I think it is important for folks to understand high yield and junk and high yield they're the same thing. It's just a different terminology. One might be more.
It's just a different terminology. Yeah. Some of these companies, they could be younger within, they might not be as well established. And for some of these companies, if they don't have the right amount of financial assets, or it really could vary with industry too. And so think about a software company. Now, don't get me wrong, there is money that's going to go into building that software out, but that's going to be a very different process versus if you need to go build like a physical manufacturing facility. Like imagine if you are a foundry, imagine if you're a large steel company versus a software company.
Sure.
Two completely different things that you're going to go try and manage. And so for some of these companies, they might have to go pay in order to go. They might have a lower credit rating, a lower FICO score, and they're just going to pay a little bit more. Now, in relation to where that credit rating falls, it's basically determining, or there's basically, you can go take a look at whether it's AAA, single A, triple B, or single B, what that likelihood that company or the issuer might be able to go pay that bondholder back.
Yep. And so one of the terms we would use then would be default risk.
Yes,
right? Because
absolutely.
Right. Because if a company was unable to pay you back, then they would be at risk of defaulting.
Yeah. And I think one interesting thing about bonds is if a company were to go bankrupt, I mean, obviously you're not trying to go pick a bond for an issuer that's going to go bankrupt.
Right.
But in the case that something does happen like that, what's interesting is where that bond falls within the capital structure.
Sure.
Now, what do I mean by capital?
Yeah,
That's a big word,
Sure.
right? And so if that company were to go bankrupt, basically, where do you fall in line to go capture back some of those bankrupt assets? And so people that hold fixed income related assets, they're more generally towards the front end of the line. And so if you had, let's just go say $10 invested, you're more likely to go get $7 or $8 back depending on what the assets are within that company. Now, some companies are just mismanaged and they're asset rich and you could get paid back all your money. Some companies, they may not be as managed correctly.
Yeah.
And so you might only get back $1 or $2. But when you think about that theoretical line, and so you have fixed income investors that are more towards the front of the line,
Right.
and then as you get further to the back of the line, that's actually where you find your equity holders or your stockholders.
Right. Yep.
And so that's why people think of fixed income as you're more safe at night. And so
Right.
not only the price doesn't fluctuate as much, but you're more in the front of that line, theoretically.
Yeah. Agreed. Yep. That's interesting. In terms of default risk, is there how many companies default or how many companies have defaulted are you aware of in the last 10, 15, 20 years?
I don't have the exact number in front of me, or I can't reference the exact number, so that might have to go be something that we can go put within the show notes per se.
Yeah.
But it is, if you stay within the investment grade universe, it is extremely low.
Right.
And one benefit that we did see when interest rates were really low during COVID is you actually saw a lot of companies being very fiscally smart, and they refinance a lot of debt. And so if you're a high yield company, so imagine you're a high yield company and you have a lot of outstanding debt at 8 or 9%. Well, if I can go refinance my debt at 2 or 3%, pay 1/3 of the cost,
Right.
and go spread that debt out 5, 10, 15 years into the future, you're financially healthy. I mean, think about this. We saw a record number of people refinance their homes during COVID because, hey, the interest rates, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I refinanced, my wife and I, we took out our first home loan. I think we were paying maybe 4.6, 4.65.
Yeah.
And we refinanced down to 3.15, 3.20.
On a 30.
Yeah, on a 30-year loan.
So as a side note, I was at an event recently, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I ran into my mortgage lender.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And she said, Kevin, you were the best rate that I've ever gotten anyone in my career.
Is it below 2? Is
on
it
a
3?
30-year, it was, I think, 2.375% on a 30-year fixed note. So
I have never heard of anything so low.
yeah,
I
was very pleased to hear that I was
that's almost
the lowest.
Those are golden handcuffs.
Yeah, they really are. Because when I think about, and this is going to lead into maybe another topic that we'll talk about, but when I think about moving to a different house or selling in the future, it makes me wonder, well, would I want to sell if I've got a rate at 2.375, or would I prefer to rent that home?
A lot of people are renting because you go think of where that prevailing rate might be. If you go take out a whole new home mortgage rate, you're thinking 7.5%. So that's 3 times as much.
Right. Absolutely. And the monthly payment, the difference between 2.375 and 7% is huge. Right.
Or just go take a look at the inventory too for how many people the Scorsone family would be competing against for a new home.
Oh, yeah.
I remember when my wife and I were looking at homes end of 2018, beginning of 2019, we would just do a general broad Zillow search around the Midland, Bay City, Saginaw area. Now, maybe it's a little more zoomed in more towards Midland and Auburn, but there were 500 properties. Jeez. That included land, homes, so on and so forth.
Right.
Now, I bet that number would probably 10 or 15%.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So much inventory off.
So interesting because we're giving you a sneak peek into a future topic
episode,
right now. Because we're talking about real estate, and that is a great topic to discuss. One of the things that I love when we talk about bonds or fixed income, particularly for folks with high income, are municipal bonds.
Absolutely.
Right? And there's what's called a tax equivalent yield with municipal bonds. And to put it in the most basic terms, if I could go buy a corporate bond today, an investment grade corporate bond at, let's say, 4.5%, but I happen to be in a very high tax bracket, and I could get a municipal bond for that similar. Let's say it was 4%, right? The tax equivalent yield to me would be almost 8% on that.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about municipal bonds,
Sure.
how beneficial they can be, and then I want to talk when we're done discussing that about how you go about choosing, let's say, a municipal bond or a bond issue, just in general.
Or, Kevin, I could talk about this for 3 or 4 hours.
Sure.
I don't get the opportunity to go talk about this. And so I appreciate, hey, I can do today's conversation any day. Call me up if you're listening out there. Besides the point though, muni bonds offer investors a really good opportunity to go earn that tax equivalent yield or that tax-free interest.
Right.
That would be given to the investor. I shouldn't say given, that's the wrong word, but that'd be credited to the investor. Now, these are municipal projects that are done by cities, counties, school districts, larger governing organizations, so on and so forth, to go fund different public products. Now, there are tax-free munis, there are taxable munis as well, but we won't focus as much on that taxable side. We're going to focus more on that tax-free side. If I'm just going to throw some broad numbers out there, that tax-free side might make up 90 to 95% of the overall market.
Right.
We can go dive into that taxable side on another different topic. However, one thing that's super interesting about that muni market is that I actually think it's very unique because if you go think about investing within corporate bonds, you are helping benefit that company, whether they are trying to refinance their debt, trying to manufacture a new facility, so on and so forth. But municipal bonds, investing within a state muni bond not only gives you the benefit of that tax-free interest from the federal level, but then also from the state level as well. And so you get that additional juice on top of that. But you could also be supporting your local school district.
Right.
Your local city with maybe a new project, maybe a new sidewalk project downtown. And so I actually think about that as, it's a very good way. I mean, a lot of people with their investments, they want to go give back.
Sure.
There might be a little bit of a philanthropic focus
Charitable.
with that as well, or charitable, sorry, that's a better word. And so with a muni bond, investors can go about doing that when still enjoying some of those philanthropic benefits from doing that. And then what's also nice too is that munis have historically, with the balance sheets and how they're run, have a much lower default rate than their equivalent corporate bonds. And so if you're to go compare two bonds, so compare a AAA muni bond or compare a single A muni bond versus a single A corporate bond, that muni bond has a much lower default rate too.
Oh, that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that. And I love exactly what you shared. And that's also for, shameless plug for TriStar Trust, right? About supporting our communities and really doing things to uplift families and communities. That's one of the great benefits to a municipal bond. I mean, obviously a large benefit for a high earner is that they're going to get that tax-free interest, right? But at the same time, if you can support your community in building a school or a bridge or a stadium or something of that nature, right? It's just it's a win-win. We're always looking for those win-win sort of opportunities.
And a lot of those bonds, they could have bond insurance that's also factored into that actual security as well. And so sometimes that insurance might be offered through an outstanding corporation, but sometimes that might actually be from the issuing state as well. And so go think about your average school district. And so your average school district is going to do a pretty good job of managing their finances. Given the money that comes in, how they manage expenses, so on and so forth. But some of those bonds might actually be backed by the different states. Now, it's going to vary from state to state, but not only would a muni bond be able to go benefit from the inherent security that a local municipality or school board, how they might manage their finances, but it might also be backed by one of these insuring bodies as well. And so it's a very safe investment.
Sure. Great. So then back to the kind of part two of my question, and it's not really specific, not at all specific to munis, but what's your process or how do you go about selecting the right bonds? And I want to share a story with our listeners too, that this was more along the line of CDs, but how Will worked to really protect one of our clients, where when you were researching different CDs, which are paying great yields right now, you came across a particular bank and you thought, because we can shop across the entire universe of banks across the United States to purchase CDs for our clients. And so Will was out looking for yields and came across, I think it may have been Signature Bank, and didn't buy that one. But why? What stood out to you about that, or what's your process in particular when it comes to bonds?
relating back to what you're mentioning with bank CDs, and so we can go purchase bank CDs from California to North or South Carolina, coast to coast. I mean, truly, I mean, not only are we objective with CDs, but we're objective across the whole company as well with the investments that we can go choose.
Yep.
Now, as relates to individual securities, just because they have FDIC insurance doesn't necessarily mean the buck or the research should stop there.
Right.
Each and every bank is going to be run differently. The management philosophy about how they manage their balance sheet is also going to be differently managed as well. And so as we're looking towards CDs, one of the more inherent things that an everyday investor could see out there is, okay, so let's just go say we're going to go try and shop for a 1-year CD.
Right.
And that average rate might be at 5%. Well, if you're seeing things that are offered below it, maybe those CDs might be inherently, maybe those are bigger banks. They could have certain features, and so maybe those are non-callable, so they can't be called back early.
Right.
But you think about yields that are above that prevailing rate, there's probably, with anything else in life, there is no free lunch.
Right.
And so if you may be seeing yields at 5.15, 5.2, 5.3%, okay, why are they selling those CDs at a higher rate? Now, it could be because they're a smaller organization. Sure, there's not as much name recognition, but sometimes those banks may not be managed in a right way. And so I don't think it was Signature Bank, but it could have been one of those other banks that failed at the beginning of 2023. But I took a deeper dive into their finances, and it just didn't sit right with me.
Yeah.
It didn't sit right with me with how some of the finances were being managed, how the management team had a philosophy of managing the excess.
Their capital or their
capital.
treasury.
Yeah, their capital, essentially so. And so because we're completely objective and we didn't have to go buy a CD that day, I'm like, you know what, Kevin, I don't see anything in the market right now. Let's go try and look out for a day or two in the future.
Yeah.
And luckily it panned out pretty well for us because unbeknownst to ourselves, 4 or 5 months in the future, that bank ends up being one of the bigger banks that had a lot of issues. And so we were very happy with that. And so with anything with fixed income, just because fixed income bonds, are supposed to be a little more, your sleep at night insurance is supposed to be a little more boring, doesn't necessarily mean they're risk-free. And so you really do need to do your homework. You really do need to go have, this is going to sound terrible, going back to more of that video game, the Marvel, like your spidey senses up, right?
Sure, yeah.
If something sounds a little too good to be true, probably is.
Typically is. Yeah. You're right. Yep. Good.
Now, in relation to trying to go pick your individual muni bonds, and so what's really unique about this industry is that there's certainly mutual funds that you can go into, but for a lot of investors, trying to go build out a good portfolio might take $500,000, $1 million, $2 million to go build out a good, well-diversified out portfolio. And so for a lot of smaller investors, I would say trying to go pick that right mutual fund might be a better option.
Right.
Because imagine if you only have $100,000, you might be able to go buy 10 or 20 bonds.
Sure.
And that could provide a really good source of income, but you want to be diversified.
Yep.
You don't want to just go buy bonds around within one county or within 5 counties. You want to go buy bonds, maybe across one state or maybe across a nation. And so mutual funds are a really good option, and there are a lot of really good cheap options out there too.
Yep.
Another really good option is opening a separately managed account.
Sure.
And so utilizing a separately managed account, you are basically giving the authority to go buy those bonds to someone else. And through doing that, they are doing all the security selection.
Right.
They are doing all that ongoing maintenance and due diligence. And so all you have to do at the end of the day is just collect your income.
Yeah. Sit back and enjoy.
Sit back and relax. Now, there could be some bond nerds out there like myself that would still like to go choose their own individual bonds, and that's still fine and dandy. And so there's a lot of really good free resources out there for investors to go look within that. Now, I would relate that back to whatever broker or whatever investment online service that you're ultimately utilizing.
Sure.
But I think what's paramount above everything else is making sure that you do your homework and you just don't buy things. Oh, I've heard it. I think they do a good job. Well, go dive into the finances.
Sure.
Do they pay their money on time?
Right.
What does their debt load look like? I mean, just imagine for yourself as a consumer, if you have a lot of outstanding debt, your incoming cash that you could have with the paycheck, if your debt is taking up, maybe 50 or 60 cents on the dollar of all the cash that's coming in, probably not a good sign.
Yeah. So we've only got a few minutes left, but I want to talk bigger picture, right? When it comes to bonds and it comes to asset allocation, you mentioned the word diversification. Right?
Absolutely.
So when it comes to investing, first thing I'll say is that, Will has talked a lot about due diligence, right? Making sure that you do your homework. And when it comes to individuals or families that are investing, it often comes back to their risk tolerance, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
How much risk are they willing to accept? How much volatility are they willing to accept in order to get their desired return?
Yeah.
And that comes down most often to an argument of art versus science, right? Where the science tells us the more you invest, the higher percentage of equities or stocks that you have in your portfolio, the greater that your return is going to be over the long term, right? However, also the more volatile your experience is going to be. So there's a relationship between stocks and bonds when we talk about diversification and asset allocation.
Sure.
So can you talk a little bit about why bonds are important for a portfolio as it pertains to risk?
Sure. Of course, super simple. And so stocks have a lot of volatility. They can move around quite a bit. Bonds don't have as much volatility. And so when you think about a portfolio, let's go use a car analogy here for a second. And so if you're to go invest purely in stocks, it's like driving on the highway. You can go get to your destination a lot faster, but if a deer pops out in front of you, it's pretty hard to go swerve out of the way.
Sure.
That diversification isn't there. Now, let's go compare driving on US 10, I-75, anything like that to you're driving down a nice suburban road. That speed limit might only be 45 or 55 miles an hour.
Yep.
If something pops up, it's a little bit easier to go try and circumvent whatever pops out in front of you. And so exactly what bonds have to do. And so if you're invested purely in the S&P 500 or all stocks,
Right.
and that index goes down by 20%, your portfolio is going to go down by 20%. But investing, having that diversification within fixed income, maybe only go down 10%.
Right.
Maybe only go down 12%. I mean, a lot of it also depends on how risky that bond fund might be, because just to go give some more plain English out there, there's three varying general areas within taxable fixed income investing. So if you're thinking about investing within corporations, and so it goes from core plus, and high yield. And so that core fixed income is going to be probably what 60 to 70% of investors will invest in.
Right.
That's your sleep at night insurance. You're not trying to do anything risky. Those bonds, a baseball analogy, they're just trying to hit enough singles over a game, and eventually they're going to go win that game. Core plus, you're starting to go down maybe a little bit more into the high yield space. Maybe they're also trying to go play around with, okay, this bond might be out of favor for 2 or 3 or 4 quarters, but I know over time their financial condition's going to improve over time. It's going to be a little bit further down the risk spectrum. And lastly, as what we just discussed, high yield. And so some high yield bonds are quite volatile, and sometimes they move around like stock prices. And so with diversification and talking about that a little bit further, if you're thinking about that, let's just go pretend you're 50% stocks, 50% bonds. That bond side, maybe it works out better if you're all core, but imagine if you were invested in other areas besides core, it might be a little more of a volatile ride.
Yep. So when I mentioned that art versus science, investing is really an emotional game, right? And for many folks, not for everyone, right?
Yeah.
And I think for the people that can handle it, a 100% S&P 500 or stock portfolio makes a lot of sense, right?
Absolutely.
But a lot of people, you've mentioned sleep at night many times, right? And in order to sleep at night, they need to know that there are some protections in place, right? That they're not just going 85 miles an hour down the highway hoping that a deer doesn't jump out in front of them, right? So that's sort of, because I think time is the most important consideration when we talk about investing. It's not so much age, it's how much time you have between now and the moment that you plan to use that money. So, someone that's 60 could be 100% equities, where someone that's 25 might want to have, 30% or more bonds in their portfolio because they just need that sleep at night comfort.
It's what makes personal finance.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, perfect. And I think we only have time for one more question. So, Kevin, an audience favorite. What did you watch this past week?
I watched.
What are you watching?
Yeah, I'm rewatching right now the Game of Thrones series that came out more recently.
Okay.
Because the next season is coming out, right? Season 2,
right around the corner.
Yep. So House of Dragons. I was drawing a blank on the name for a moment there, but House of Dragons. So we started to rewatch that series because I think either in mid-June, I think season 2 is coming out, and I'm a big geek when it comes to Game of Thrones and House of Dragons. So how about yourself?
I have been rewatching some old stuff for Star Wars.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, they've had a lot of spin-off shows come out lately, and I believe one is coming out later or mid-June, or maybe it's early June. Early June or mid-June. Don't quote me exactly when that might come out, but I'm rewatching some of these old films, and maybe I wouldn't consider myself old. I'm going to turn 30 later this year, but for some of these films, I'm thinking in my head, I haven't seen these films in 30 years, or not. Yeah. Oh gosh, not 30 years. I haven't seen some of these films since 25. Like 25 years.
Yeah.
And it's just so crazy because, I have a general idea what's going to happen throughout the film, but I miss some of those smaller details. And so I've been having a lot of fun reliving a lot of early childhood memories. So,
well, you would have loved. I took Gigi to the Comic-Con, the Motor City Comic-Con.
Oh, really?
2 weeks ago,
Yeah,
I think
sure.
it was. Her and her cousin or my nephew. And we had a great time. And there were a lot of folks dressed up.
I should have gone
Star
down.
Wars in particular. So I think it's coming back in November.
Okay.
So maybe you'll join us.
Absolutely. Well, with that being said, thank you again, everyone, for listening to another great episode.